Alright folks, put away the WikiLeaks, put on some music you have illegally downloaded from the Pirate Bay, and toke up a joint. It is time to talk about libertarianism. This is the second of the liberal theories we're going to talk about. Today we're going to go through some of the basics of libertarianism, what makes it characteristic as opposed to liberal egalitarianism. And also talk a little bit about the political expression of it, its connection with markets and democracy, and the varieties of things that are sort of like libertarianism in this sense, but are not quite libertarianism. Now, one caveat as we get started. We're going to be talking about libertarianism in this session in basically the manner that it is used in contemporary American political discourse. So my anarchist friends are all going to come and beat me up for doing it this way, because there is a perfectly good sense of libertarianism that is associated with sort of complete resistance to any kind of government or hierarchical control. But we're going to talk about it the way that people use it around here in the US right about now, to refer to basically the kind of thing that Ron Paul believes in, the kind of thing that the Libertarian Party believes in, a political theory that focuses very much on individual liberties, tends to be business friendly, tends to be government regulation unfriendly, and that sort of thing. Okay, so how do you get there? Well, basic ideas from behind libertarianism. First, it is still a liberal theory. So all of the general liberal principles that we talked about last time apply to libertarianism as much as to liberal egalitarianism. Libertarianism is an individualist theory. It focuses on individual rights. It wants to understand anything having to do with supra-individual collectives in terms of the effects on individuals. And it is also basically a deontological theory. It is a theory that focuses on what it is right or wrong to do to individual human beings, rather than how we promote some good overall ends, the way that utilitarianism and other consequentialist views do. One thing that makes it different from most of the liberal egalitarian views, and this is something that Robert Nozick, who is sort of, if Rawls is the father of contemporary liberal egalitarianism, Nozick is the father of contemporary libertarianism in a lot of ways, at least for philosophers. You non-philosophers may have to make do with Hayek or somebody like that, but we get Nozick. So this point is something that he hammered on a lot. Libertarianism is a procedural rather than a patterned idea of distributive justice and fairness. All this means is that whereas the liberal egalitarians tend to focus on a notion of fairness that has to do with the question of, when we look at society, who ends up with what? They have this default assumption of egalitarianism, that, unless you have some special reason to, you should look at society and everybody should have more or less the same. And liberal egalitarians think that if you have inequalities, these need to be justified in some way by the benefit that they give to the less well-off. Libertarians tend to be proceduralists. They say, look, it doesn't matter who ends up with what. Any number of possible distributions of stuff could be perfectly just, because the only thing that matters for whether or not the distribution is just is how we got there. If we have a totally egalitarian distribution, but we got there through horribly immoral means, then that's unjust. If we have a distribution where one person or very few people have a huge amount of the stuff, well, as long as they got it fairly, then that's just. You can see some of the way that this plays out in some of the discourse about the 1% and the 99% that's come out since the Occupy Wall Street movement's been around. On the one hand, you have the folks who like the slogan, "We are the 99%, the folks who tend to be sympathetic to the Occupy Wall Street approach. who look out at the pattern of distribution of wealth in the United States and they say, look, the pattern is massively unequal. And they have a view that is usually either, or possibly sometimes a combination of the two, either the view that this concentration of wealth that we have in the United States could not possibly have been arrived at through just means, or they say even if it was arrived at without anyone doing anything overtly wrong, it's wrong to have it this way. Even if no individual person did anything wrong to any other individual person, it's wrong to have this kind of imbalance. Libertarians look out at this and they say, look, if the very wealthy people in the United States got there through voluntary exchange and other kinds of perfectly acceptable ways of becoming wealthy, then, hey, they deserve it all. And who are you to complain about it? And some of this comes down to the question of how skeptical are you of the claim that the people with a lot of wealth in our society got there or could have gotten there through perfectly just means. A lot of non-libertarians will look at it and say, no, I'm deeply skeptical that anyone got there through being a nice guy. Whereas a lot of libertarians will, you'll see articles like this in the Wall Street Journal. A lot of libertarians will say, okay, well, show me the proof. You're complaining, if you want to complain about these people who are wealthy, you tell me what this person did that was wrong or illegal or whatever that got them there. And they don't share this general skepticism. But anyway, the whole idea is that for the libertarians, all that matters is how you got there. It doesn't matter how high you rise, it just matters how you got there. All right, so that goes to the next bullet point, which is that the particular understanding of what makes a distribution just is if you got there through a process of just original acquisition. So anything that was unowned, you took out of the natural world in a morally appropriate way. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean in a minute. And voluntary transfer. So once people take things out of the natural world, then they make voluntary exchanges among each other, and that's how we get to whatever kind of distribution pattern we have. For most libertarians, in some way or another, the overriding thing they're concerned about is the inviolability of personal freedom. Libertarians might think that other things are nice. Not all libertarians have to be completely lacking in compassion or any of that sort of caricature, but they'll say that, sure, it is unfortunate if some people are in very dire straits. It's not a good thing that they're there, but we should not bring them out of that. We should not seek to bring them out of that in a way that violates personal freedom. Personal freedom is more important than more or less any other good or bad thing in the world that you might be concerned with. And as a result of this, one of the key ideas that goes behind libertarian political thinking, and this again, the phrasing of this is due to Nozick, is the recognition that giving something to someone is always taking it from someone else. This is where libertarians get really exercised about taxation. You'll read liberal egalitarians and they will talk about, well, the government ought to redistribute wealth in various ways, or the government ought to ensure that there is equal opportunity. The libertarians are going to say, that all sounds really nice, but we have to be careful, because if the government ensures equal opportunity, and that takes resources, those resources come from somewhere. They don't come from this nebulous thing, the government. The government gets all of the resources that it's going to give to anybody else by taking them from someone. So you at least have to be honest about where you're getting things from and where they're going. Now, to be fair, most of the liberal egalitarians that we've talked about do recognize this. When we talk about, when Kimlicka mentions the stakeholder idea, well, it's coming from someone. It's coming from massive wealth taxes. Rawls, in his Property-Owning Democracy, also supports the idea of especially very, very heavy inheritance taxes. Dworkin essentially justifies taxation as this form of social insurance. So they recognize that it's coming from somewhere, but the libertarians, especially Nozick, often think that people don't pay sufficient attention to the fact that it's coming from somewhere. The liberal egalitarians focus on how wonderful it is to give people things, and they don't focus sufficiently on the moral problem with taking things. And then lastly, like the liberal egalitarians, many libertarians rely on some notion of social contract in order to justify and legitimate the polity that they think is the one we ought to have. All right. So let's start with looking at the details of what a libertarian picture of the just polity looks like. It's going to look different in some ways from the liberal egalitarian polity. So let's see what those are. Okay. The first thing to keep in mind as we go through this as a general point is that when I talk about what libertarians think is acceptable, more so in a lot of ways than a lot of the other theories we're looking at, many libertarians make a very strong distinction between what is moral on the political scale and what's moral on the personal scale. Libertarianism is ultimately a theory about what can be legitimately enforced, what kinds of things state power can be used to make happen. It's not a theory about what's morally good on a personal level. So, for instance, most libertarian theorists would be horrified by the idea that the state could take money from you through taxation for basically charitable purposes. But they don't necessarily think that being a good person, they don't necessarily think that you could be a good person as an individual if you did not voluntarily give up some of your money for charitable purposes. There certainly are libertarians who make a positive virtue out of a kind of selfishness. Ayn Rand, who incidentally wrote most of a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, would be an exception there. But for the most part, libertarians don't have that kind of positively selfish worldview. And in fact, a lot of libertarians see one of the advantages of removing government regulation and removing government taxation, that it will allow for the creation of voluntary associations, the increase of voluntary giving, and essentially the provision of what we in a place like the US provide via the state through a network of private and voluntary associations that get the job done. They get poor people into homes, they get the sick medical care and this sort of thing, but without illicitly forcing anyone to do it. Of course, whether or not that would work is a partly empirical claim, but all I'm saying is that the libertarians aren't necessarily motivated by not wanting to help people. The core of the theory is about what the state can enforce, not about what you ought to do absent state enforcement. Okay, so what are the legitimate uses of state enforcement? For most libertarians, there are really two core uses, and there's a little addendum to the second one. The first legitimate use of state power is defense of the right to life, and importantly, defense from external threat. So most libertarians hold that there can be a strong military, and in fact the government can coercively tax, possibly even conscript, in order to ensure that there is a strong military. Now, libertarians do tend to move towards the defensive, isolationist side of things when it comes to what the military can be used for. On this sort of thing, Ron Paul is actually typical of a kind of hardline libertarianism. The same way that libertarians are skeptical of the use of state power to accomplish particular idealistic goals within the society, healing the sick, feeding the poor, that sort of thing, they tend to be skeptical of using the military to achieve goals besides narrow self-defense outside of the society. So you may have libertarians who are sympathetic to preemptive and preventative use of the military. But at least typically for the theory, the core idea is going to be that whatever you use the military for, it should be pretty closely tied to defense of the nation. And for a lot of libertarians, the ideal is a pretty isolationist one. The military kind of stands around the borders of the country and stops anyone from coming in. They don't go out and try to interfere with what other folks are doing. Okay. Internally, the core legitimate use of state power is to defend property rights and enforce contracts. So basically what the police do on this kind of model. So you have a military and you have a police. And not much else, at least on most core libertarian theories. This has led sometimes to people to describe the idealized libertarian state as the night watchman state. The state is just around to prevent violence, make sure everybody follows some really basic rules, show up when there's an emergency, and otherwise let people kind of do their own thing. Tied to the internal defense of property rights and enforcement of contracts, and also the internal defense of right to life, because of course external enemies are not the only thing that kills people. One of the core things that governments are often thought to do on a libertarian model is prevent interpersonal harm. So again, this goes with this kind of night watchman picture of the state. We're more or less allowed to do whatever we want, as long as we're not hurting each other. The government steps in when somebody's going to hurt somebody else and stops them from doing that. Now, there is a little bit of a theoretical issue with this prevention of interpersonal harm. Kimlicka doesn't talk about it a lot, but since it comes up for a lot of libertarian theories, it's worth mentioning. The basic issue is, once you say the government is allowed to prevent interpersonal harm, you get a question about, well, what exactly do we mean by harm? And one of the very traditional libertarian articulations of what we mean by harm comes from John Stuart Mill, and from his book On Liberty, which is taken to be one of the classics of libertarian thought. Now, you may remember John Stuart Mill from such theories as utilitarianism, and that's true, and it's a little bit awkward that he shows up in both places. So let me give you the 30-second historical digression. The political view that Mill articulates in On Liberty is very much the kind of thing that would be recognizable to a modern-day libertarian. Government is there to enforce contracts, people live their own lives, that sort of thing. Mill has an argument, and you can ask me about it in class. Mill has an argument that utilitarianism entails this kind of libertarianism. Many people are skeptical that it works out that nicely, that in every single case you will improve aggregate utility by letting people do what they want, unless they violate certain kinds of interpersonal harms. And 99% of On Liberty is taken up with articulating a very principled, deontological sounding libertarianism, with only a small nod to, oh, and all of this should be backed up by aggregate utility. So people dispute about this. Mill thinks he is both a utilitarian and a libertarian. There are many folks who like the utilitarian Mill but don't think that the libertarianism follows from it, and there are also plenty of folks who like the libertarian Mill but don't think you either need or should want utilitarianism to back it up. Okay, historical digression over. So, Mill argues that when we talk about harm, what we should mean is either direct injury, I punch you in the face, and the only indirect injuries, the only indirect harms that should be allowed to count as harms that the state could interfere with are violations of what he calls distinct and assignable duties. So the basic problem that Mill is trying to solve here is that we can't define harm as anything that I do that might have a bad effect on you, because this will blow up libertarianism. Government police powers would essentially become unlimited. on that kind of view. Or it would become something much more like straightforward utilitarianism. And the problem is there's all sorts of things that I can do that have adverse effects on you. If we are rivals in business, then, you know, if my business does well and captures greater market share, your business will be harmed, you'll have less money, and you'll be less well off than before. If you and I are both in love with the same woman and she marries me, you're probably less well off than you would have been if I hadn't done that. Should the government get involved? Even things like things that modern day libertarians tend to be very strong on, right? Take something like homosexuality. A very standard, pretty libertarian style argument about this is say, well, look, if you don't like homosexuality, then great. No one is making you be gay. But if we allow the harm principle to be unrestricted, if we allow it to be anything that causes any kind of adverse effect on people, then we end up with things like, well, if I and my boyfriend are, you know, making out on 17th Street and someone who does not like homosexuals sees us, that will make them feel bad. Have we harmed them? Clearly there's a sense in which we have, right? Clearly there's a sense in which if I drive your business out of business through pure market operations, if I marry the woman you're in love with, if I make out with my boyfriend and disgust you, clearly there is a sense in which you are harmed. But for a lot of people, it's intuitive that this is not the kind of harm we're talking about when we talk about the government only being able to get involved when people are hurting each other. So this is why Mill and a lot of libertarians basically following Mill want to restrict the kind of harm that the government can get involved with to pretty direct kinds of harm. Moral harm is typically excluded. Harm that arises because you're disgusted by stuff that I do or you don't like stuff that I do is typically excluded. It doesn't completely exclude things like emotional or psychological harm, but it restricts their scope significantly. And it relies typically on, there's a pretty intuitive difference between if I make out with my boyfriend and you're disgusted, that's a kind of psychological harm, but it's an indirect one, versus if I stalk and harass you. That's a very different kind of psychological harm. It's malicious, it's directed at you, it's very much more connected with my actions and a direct harm on you. Now, the distinct and assignable duties bit is just there because there are certain kinds of indirect harm that we probably do want to include. And most of them are kind of vaguely contractual, so they go with this spirit that the government is there and is legitimately there to enforce contracts. Direct and assignable duties are particular connections that I have or that you have, typically ones that have been voluntarily entered into. Maybe not always. I probably have direct and assignable duties to my parents, even though I didn't voluntarily enter into a contract with them. But this is things like, if I don't ensure that my daughter has food, probably it makes sense for the government to be able to come and punish me and to try to make me provide food for her. Because I have a distinct and assignable duty to my daughter. I don't have a distinct and assignable duty to your daughter. If I know that your daughter is starving and I could provide food to her, on the typical libertarian picture, I don't have any obligation to do that. I haven't harmed your daughter if I eat my cheeseburger instead of giving it to her. It's only people to whom I have a distinct and assignable duty. The assignableness is also important because the libertarians and Mill certainly also want to avoid things like they don't want to allow moves like saying, well, if a child is starving, everyone has a duty to help that child. Mill wants to say, morally speaking, sure, maybe it would be nice, maybe you'd be a good person, but the only enforceable duties, the only duties that there ought to be rules about, that we ought to coerce people into following, are assignable ones. Nobody can make me do the thing that everybody ought to do. They can only make me do the things that Daniel Levine ought to do. Okay. So keep that in mind, and it's not something that comes into some of the really deep theoretical stuff that Kymlicka is concerned about, but keep it in mind. Okay, back to what libertarian justice looks like. So we talked about sort of the core principles of the government, and so the question is, well, how does this come out into distribution? It turns out this basically is what gets you this procedural rather than patterned picture of distribution. Typically, for libertarians, when we look at distribution, we talk about what kinds of rules ought to govern it. They look like this. First is absolute or more or less absolute self-ownership. Not every libertarian theory, as Kymlicka points out, really focuses on this. A lot of them do. Nozick certainly does. Most of them end up here, even if they don't take it as a basic principle. Self-ownership just means that I have the sole right to decide what happens to me and my body. No one can enslave me. No one can force me to do anything except within the very narrow bounds of preventing me from harming others, enforcing my contracts, that sort of thing. Following from absolute self-ownership, when we look around at the created things in the world, which is almost everything, when we look around at the created things in the world, I get ownership of all artifacts that I create with my own resources. The Lockean phrase is, I mix my labor with the world. So if I own some wood and I make a chair out of it, I own the chair. And in particular, on some theories, the act of mixing my labor with unowned material can make the material mine. So if there's some unowned wood and I make a chair out of it, that is what lets me own the chair, even though I didn't initially own the wood. We'll talk about more about this in a sec. All right, so far this is a pretty autarkic world. I own myself. I own anything that I make out of stuff that I own. But what about other people? How do they get stuff? Can we all only own the things that we make ourselves? Well, of course not. What libertarians typically allow for is a regime of voluntary transfer. So I own myself. As a result of owning myself, I own the stuff I make. If you make something that I want, the way I can get it from you is by offering you something that I've made that you want. So our system evolves and grows and changes through multiple series of voluntary transfers. The last question about how this works is, well, how does this all get off the ground? If you try to follow this backwards, if you imagine following this backwards, you say, well, I own myself, I own anything I make out of resources that I made, and I own anything I get from other people, which comes back to things they made out of resources that they had. How do we get the resources in the first place? And so most libertarian theories have some doctrine of original acquisition. The idea is that there are, or at least there were, bits of the resources in the world that were initially unowned. And there are rules about how you take unowned stuff in the world and make it into stuff you own. And then once you own it, you can do voluntary transfers and yada, yada, yada. There are some important differences in how this works out. Nozick, who Kymlicka focuses on in the chapter, Nozick's view is basically, at least what Nozick takes to be Locke's view, which is that the world is basically unowned, or it's at least functionally unowned. There's some bits about God. We can talk about where God fits into Locke's picture. God does not fit into Nozick's picture. We can talk about where he fits into Locke's picture, if you want. So for Nozick, there are things that are basically functionally unowned, and then the way we come to own them is through original acquisition. If something is unowned, you can basically acquire it by fiat. And especially you can acquire it by mixing your labor with it. Different libertarians have different views of sort of how much labor you have to mix with it. If you look out over an expanse of land and you say, lo, this land is mine, is that enough? It's some labor. Or do you actually have to make something with it? Locke's view tended very much more towards the you have to make use of it side of the spectrum. Nozick and a lot of the contemporary libertarians seem to think that it's more of a fiat-based kind of picture. And this kind of view gets you the sort of typical libertarian polity, where there are large inequalities, laissez-faire economics, corporations, night watchman state, limited redistribution of wealth to no redistribution of wealth, yada yada. There are alternate views on this. If you read the Valentine piece on left libertarianism, for instance, one significant alternate view is to take seriously the idea that before anyone owns bits of the world individually, the world is owned in common by all of humankind. So to take seriously the difference between Nozick's reading of Locke and what it sounds like Locke actually says. If the world is owned in common, things look pretty different. If the world is owned in common, I can't walk up to an expanse of land and say, lo, this land is mine, and then use it exclusively and exclude you from the use of it. If the world is owned in common, at least initially, then perhaps I need to negotiate with you in order to appropriate a piece of land that is not owned by any individual person. And that negotiation may lead to you extracting certain concessions from me. You might say, fine, you can take this land as as your farmland and improve it, but you have to pay 10% of it back into a fund for the common good. Or you can take this much land but no more. We don't agree to you taking any more land. Or you can take this much land, but when you die, it reverts to common ownership. You can't pass it on. If you accept a view that the world, the natural resources, are initially commonly owned rather than unowned, this can lead to pretty radically different pictures of what the polity now should look like. And so many left libertarians, like Valentine, like Hillel Steiner, they will justify particular political systems that look a lot more like redistributivist ones on the grounds that the natural resources of the world were originally owned in common. You could even imagine a kind of Marxist interpretation of this view. A Marxist might say, if we were taking seriously the idea that the natural resources of the world were originally owned in common, no one would ever have agreed to a capitalist system. We would have agreed to keep natural resources collectively owned and collectively managed, rather than allowing individuals to take them. So, it is often not incredibly strongly emphasized by libertarians, at least by the sort of standard libertarians. But the standard libertarian picture actually depends pretty heavily on the idea that natural resources are initially unowned and can be unilaterally acquired, rather than having been owned in common and needing to be acquired by agreement with other people around. Okay. All right. So that's basically the picture of what at least the mainstream libertarian polity looks like, what libertarians tend to think about justice. I need a moment for another digression, which is that these policies are tied to a particular kind of theoretical underpinning, but they're not the exclusive province of it. So just like I mentioned in class, both utilitarians and libertarians will probably agree that you should torture the minimum number of babies possible. There are other kinds of views that can converge on this kind of polity, where you have minimal government interference except to prevent interpersonal and external threat, distribution on the basis of voluntary transfer and original acquisition, often leading to fairly free markets and that sort of thing, without necessarily being libertarian in the deep philosophical sense that Kimlicka is using it and then I'm going to use it. Now, I am not here in any way. I inevitably when I do this, I get at least one student saying, well, I believe X. Can I be a libertarian? And I'm not here to police anyone's political labeling. That's not the point. The point is just to distinguish some near cousins of this kind of philosophical notion of libertarianism from libertarianism itself. Because there very likely are folks out there, maybe even folks listening to this, who think of themselves as libertarians, who are strong supporters of libertarian policies in the sense of free markets, limited government, that sort of thing, but who will not see themselves in the kinds of technical theoretical arguments that Kimlicka is talking about and that I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. So, in this sense, in the philosophical sense of libertarianism that I'm going to be concerned with in this lecture, or that I guess the lecture's been going on for a while, so that I have been concerned with, libertarianism is defined by views about the fundamental priority of voluntary arrangements, not by particular policy outcomes. If you believe in the fundamental priority of voluntary arrangements, it is very likely that you will end up believing in very limited government, laissez-faire economics, that sort of thing. But you can get their other routes. And in particular, there are at least two other kinds of justifications for libertarian policies that are not necessarily based on philosophical libertarianism in the sense that we're going to be discussing it. So first is, plenty of utilitarians, plenty of folks who are primarily motivated by what they believe will lead to the greatest good, support minimal government, laissez-faire economics, that sort of thing. In fact, this is very typical basic sort of thumbnail of what a lot of mainstream economists believe. So you may not think that there's any deep fundamental priority to voluntary transactions, but you may believe with a lot of economists that, in fact, the system that will lead to the greatest good for the greatest number is something like a system that has a very small government, has largely unregulated markets, and that sort of thing. Right? This is the Adam Smith invisible hand justification for things like markets. There's nothing inherently libertarian in the philosophical sense about this. If you're a utilitarian who believes this, then you may very well, if you come to believe different things about the facts, support heavier government taxation. In particular, a lot of utilitarians who otherwise look like libertarians are willing to accept that there are situations of market failure where the government ought to step in. So, because of utility, healthcare is one possible area. There are features of the markets for healthcare in particular that most of us are not experts on healthcare. We require specialized knowledge to participate in the market. So the assumption that we know on our own what is best for us is often violated when it comes to medical decision making. And healthcare decisions are often made under serious time pressures and they're often literally life and death. So the idea is a typical market works by, if I don't like how much this bicycle is selling for, I can look for a cheaper one, I can sort of browse around, I can do without a bicycle for a while, whereas in healthcare markets, if my doctor says, look, your appendix burst, we got to go into surgery. I'm typically neither going to say, well, I don't know. I'm not sure I believe you when you say my appendix burst. I want to check it out for myself. And I'm also typically not going to say, well, let me shop around before I decide whether or not to let you do surgery on me or someone else do surgery on me. There's a limited amount of this, but it's distorted and restricted in healthcare markets. So anyway, lots of people are willing to say healthcare is an area where there's market failure. There's also issues about insurance, right? Healthcare is an area where there's market failure. Therefore, we'd be better off with a government-run or government-regulated or partially socialized or whatever healthcare system. Let's go do it. A libertarian in the philosophical sense would say, I don't care about that, right? I don't care if European countries have better outcomes and spend a smaller percentage of GDP on healthcare than the US does. That's not the point. The point is what the government can legitimately do with my money, what the government can legitimately demand that I give tax money for, whether it's efficient is secondary. Hey, it might be nice if it's efficient, but that's where sort of philosophical libertarians and utilitarians who support libertarian-like policies may diverge. The other kind of kissing cousin to libertarianism is what you might call right-wing liberal egalitarianism. Liberal egalitarianism is typically associated with lefty, at least lefty in the American European sense, policies. Welfare, heavy redistribution of wealth, job training programs, food stamps, aid to the poor, public education, public health care financing, that sort of stuff. But to some extent, there's an empirical premise in liberal egalitarians' support for those sorts of policies. And there are people who are libertarian-ish, who support things like limited welfare systems and free markets for basically liberal egalitarian grounds. I'm actually not familiar with any philosophical voices that take a strong stand on this, but this is certainly something that is out there in the political discourse. So there are people who believe that, like the liberal egalitarians, believe that in a just society, what we should be looking for is offices open to talents. That's a meritocracy, fair equality of opportunity, and this is in fact sometimes a benefit claimed for market-based systems. He's probably not the first person to say this, but he's the first person I heard say this. Richard Posner, prominent libertarian justice on the judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. He has been a booster for the idea that markets get rid of racism. He says, the only color that markets care about is green. If there was some company, if nobody was willing to hire blacks or Latinos or women or foreigners or whatever, despite their qualifications, and there was some company that was willing to do that, that company would win, because they would be able to get all these qualified blacks at below market prices because of the racism of other companies. The non-racists would automatically win in a market system, is the idea. So there are folks who support libertarian-esque policies on basically liberal egalitarian grounds. People will say, look, I don't oppose welfare systems because I think it is illicit for the government to take my money. I oppose welfare systems because I think they create a culture of dependency that, in fact, keeps people from being able to participate fully and have a fair equality of opportunity and that sort of thing. So there are right-wing liberal egalitarians who will support libertarian-like policies, but not necessarily be fully philosophically libertarian in the sense we're going to talk about. In the real world, of course, many people who support libertarian policies, or libertarian-ish policies, for lack of a better word, they have views that are a little bit of an amalgam of all of these things. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of class. Very few people in their everyday lives have these nice, segmented, clean, smooth-lined, Bauhaus-like moral or political theories. So it's perfectly possible for someone to believe that liberty is really important in itself, and also markets lead to the best outcomes. This is a matter of sort of conceptual clarification and slicing off where the differences might be and where you might have to make a decision when push comes to shove, right? When you look at the WHO numbers on healthcare expenditures and outcomes, you may have to decide, do I care more about the idea that the government should not be able to tax me for something like healthcare, should not be able to make me buy healthcare if I don't want to buy healthcare insurance, or do I care more about, economic efficiency? All right, so let's talk about the people who actually are libertarians. What's underlying here is some form of libertarian social contract. Typically, these kinds of social contracts are they're not hypothetical. They're not about what we would choose if we were perfectly rational. They're often not even about what we did choose. They don't make any sort of claim about what the polity was actually founded on. What they tend to focus on is what kinds of governments we could have gotten from an initial state of anarchy, of a non-governmental state, without violating anyone's rights. Given that there are deficiencies in the initial state of anarchy, how could we get to a government, and what is the maximum form of government we could get to? All right. So one version of this kind of state of nature argument, social contract argument, is Nozick's. And Nozick has a minimal state argument. So Nozick ultimately argues that a state can be justified, but only what he calls a minimal state. Minimal state is one essentially that has military and police powers and can coercively tax to maintain the military and police, but nothing else. It does nothing else. There's no Department of Education, there's no Environmental Protection Agency, probably. There's no welfare programs that are run by the state. All it does is make sure that people don't hurt each other and that they adhere to their contracts. So, how could we have gotten to that kind of state, and why is that the maximum kind of state we could have gotten to? So Nozick says, all right, start by assuming that we have an anarchic system. Now, for Nozick, it's important to note that Nozick is starting from a kind of Lockean anarchy, not a kind of Hobbesian anarchy. And the important difference is this. For the Hobbesian, there are no moral rules. Well, to a first approximation, there aren't really any moral rules in the pre-societal, pre-governmental state. For a Lockean like Nozick, there are fundamental moral rules. In particular, even in the state of anarchy, we have a right to life and a right to property, morally speaking. Everyone recognizes that it is wrong to kill people, unless you have some specialized justification, and it is wrong to take anything that people rightfully own. And in the Nozickian state of anarchy, people recognize the rules of property acquisition. They recognize that you can unilaterally appropriate unowned things, that you own yourself, and that you own anything with which you mix your labor, at least if you're allowed to mix your labor with it in the first place. You can't go into someone's house, make a cake with their flour and eggs, and then own the cake. But if they give you that, then you can do it. So, to a large extent, Nozick's state of anarchy, Nozick's state of nature, is a kind of anarcho-capitalism. People believe in property rights, but there's no enforcement mechanism for it. And also importantly, for Nozick, most people in the state of nature are motivated to follow the rules most of the time. This isn't a situation where, because there's no enforcement, everybody just takes whoever else's property all the time. They don't care about the moral rule. People really believe in the moral rules. The problem in the Locke/Nozick state of nature, this kind of anarchy, is that even if we are sincerely trying to follow the rules, we're all basically good people, we all basically believe in this, we're going to have some problems. The first is that everybody is going to suffer lapses. There are inevitably going to be times when I know that it's wrong for me to take your stuff, but I do it anyway. There are going to be some people who maybe are lapsarians all the time, right? There may be a few people who just don't care about the rules. And even among people who are not overcome with weakness of will, or who are not the few people who just don't care about the rules, we're going to have disputes. There are going to be cases where reasonable people disagree about the application of the rules, both because we have limited information and because, as both Locke and Nozick point out, we all tend to be biased towards ourselves. If there's a gray area, it's very easy for me to tell myself that really I'm in the right, even if things are a little bit murky. So we'll have fights over resources, over violations of the rules. So what Nozick thinks will happen is, first, people will say, well, look, I know that most people are going to try to follow the rules, but occasionally there will be fights. So if I live in this state of nature, I'm going to say, well, I better learn how to fight. I better be able to defend my interests if this comes up. So I'm going to learn how to make swords. I'm going to go to the gym and pump up and, that sort of thing. It's not going to take all of my time, because this isn't the Hobbesian state of nature. I'm not constantly watching my back, but I've got to invest some resources in doing this. Well, the natural thing Nozick thinks that will happen in this kind of case is eventually most of us will realize, look, I am not an expert fighter. And if I want to become an expert fighter, I'm going to have to devote all of my time to that. And that will stop me from being an expert philosopher, or an expert farmer, or an expert whatever the heck I might rather do with my life than fighting. Now, there will be a few people who really like being expert fighters. And so what will happen, with nobody violating anybody's rights, what will happen is there will be a growth of private protective organizations, specialists in protection. So I will say, I am good at philosophy, you are good at fighting. I'll tell you what, you spend your day bulking up and promise that whenever there's a fight, you will fight on my behalf. And I'll spend my time getting really good at philosophy, and then I'll teach you some philosophy. Or, more usefully, maybe I become an expert farmer and I give food to the warriors. So you start with the private protective associations. Long story short, the private protective associations will tend to fight. Everyone will want to sign up with the ones that win, and so at least in each geographic area, because it'll be harder to sign up for the ones further out, at least in each geographic area, you'll have a dominant protective association that will be the only one that operates in that area. At this point, you have what Nozick calls an ultra-minimal state. You have... Actually, no. Take that back. There's one more step for the ultra-minimal state. This is the ultra-minimal state. He doesn't call it that, but that's what it is. This is still private protective associations. This is what will tend to happen. But there will be some people who, either through lack of inclination or through lack of resources, will not sign up for the protective services of the protective association. So Nozick thinks, in order to maintain order, the protective association will necessarily basically say, no other protective associations are allowed here, and we will not allow anyone to take the law into their own hands. Or take the rules into their own hands. Not really law, properly speaking, yet. We will suppress anyone who tries to become an expert in violence outside of the bounds of our protective association. You have to join up, or you can't use force. So this is an ultra-minimal state. Now that they've suppressed all other users of force. It's ultra-minimal in the sense that the protective association doesn't do wealth redistribution. The protective association just does protection and enforcement of contract. But it's ultra-minimal in the sense that since there are some people who cannot or will not sign up, even though they're not allowed to take things into their own hands, they're not protected by the association. So if I don't pay the association and you come and steal from me, I can't go to them and ask them to get my stuff back. They'll say, well, you're not a client. So Nozick thinks that this is actually an intolerable situation. Once you get to the point that the protective associations have to suppress all competitors in the area, now we've got a problem, which is that now my natural rights are potentially being violated, because if I don't buy into the association, people can steal from me with impunity. And Nozick thinks the way to solve this is not to say, well, okay, they have to let you defend yourself if you don't want to or can't pay in. Nozick's response is to say, because they are dominant, they must work on behalf of everybody in the area. They must work on behalf of everybody in the area. And this allows them both to force people who can pay but may not want to pay into the association, and also for them to force people who pay in to pay extra to cover the cost of protecting people who can't pay in. So basically, a rudimentary form of taxation. Now, the justification of the taxation for Nozick is not that everyone's better off. The justification of the taxation for Nozick is that you essentially cannot effectively protect most people's rights without this kind of suppression. And if you have the suppression of self-help without protection from the association, that would violate other people's rights. So the only way you can get everybody's rights protected is a kind of rudimentary taxation where the only thing that you're allowed to redistribute is resources to pay the protective association to protect everyone's rights, even folks who are indigent, who couldn't normally pay. Now, this is a complicated argument. Kimlicka doesn't get into all the details. It's an interesting one. Don't know if it works. Complicated. We can talk about it more. But that's the basic sketch of it. You go from anarchy, rise of protective associations, dominance of protective associations, suppression of self-help, to taxation to provide protection for everyone. And now you have a minimal state. All the state does, or this sort of state-like thing does, is enforce contracts, defend against external threats, defend against internal violence, but everyone needs to pay into it. Everyone can be coerced to pay into it. All right, so that's one picture of how you would get there. This is one picture of what legitimates the state that leads to a very minimal state, hence the name minimal state, very limited state, a state that does not engage in large-scale redistribution, and as a result, the distribution of things will basically follow along from the libertarian picture. The distribution of things will be based on original acquisition, voluntary transfer, because that's what the protective associations will enforce, because those are the natural rights that everybody has. All right, there are other ways of being a libertarian. The main other one that Kimlicka talks about is mutual advantage theories. And the main difference is that the mutual advantage folks, like prominently Gaudier, Harman in some moods, interestingly Rousseau, though Rousseau basically has this kind of view of how government gets put together, but not as a way, not to say that, oh, and that's what makes government legitimate. Rousseau has basically this view, and then the punchline for Rousseau is basically, and that's why government is a swindle, that the rich perpetrate on the poor. So Rousseau actually has an analysis of government that looks like libertarianism. That is exactly why he is not a libertarian. Okay. So for mutual advantage theory, the main difference is that you start without morality. In this anarchic state, it's more of a Hobbesian anarchy, where nobody has any rules. Nobody has any morality. Nobody accepts any moral rules. So the question then that the mutual advantage folks ask is, what kind of moral bargains would people strike in this kind of situation, given unequal bargaining power? Right? So this isn't the Rawlsian picture where we imagine a kind of equalization or a veil of ignorance. This is a picture where we say, if people as they actually are came together and made a contract, what kind of contract would they make? What kind of arrangement could you get to through actual voluntary bargaining? The mutual advantage theorists think that you would get to something. You would not end up saying there's nothing that everybody would accept. But unlike the Rawlsians, unlike the liberal egalitarians, they're going to say in the contracting moment, people are in fact not equal. In the contracting moment, people have whatever they have, and they will bargain to keep that. Some people will be stronger, some people will command more resources, some people will be better liked, whatever. So you end up with a basically libertarian-looking polity on this grounds, one where there's minimal state, minimal redistribution, mostly voluntary transfer, but protection of life and property, because folks like Gaudier say, folks like Rousseau say, sometimes folks like Hume say, look, everyone likes keeping their stuff. It is in everyone's interest, generally speaking, to have a rule that personal property is protected. Even the poor don't want to have a rule that says personal property is not protected because, they have something and they don't want to lose what little they have. On the other hand, Only the weak like taking other people's stuff. Only people who don't have stuff want it redistributed. If you're wealthy, you don't want a rule that says, let's take all the stuff and spread it around equally. It's only if you're poor that you want that rule. Well, and guess what? The weak are weak. That's their problem. And we don't have to listen to them very much. So the idea is that if you have a contract between actual people, what will happen is everyone will agree on rules about keeping your own stuff. Only the weaker people will say, well, how about we spread this around more equally? And the strong people will say, no, and you can't make us. We would rather go back to the state of nature where, things are uncertain and there are all sorts of problems. We have to worry about uprisings and fighting and this sort of thing. But we're strong. We'd rather that than agree to give all our stuff up. So you end up with a situation that is pretty minimal redistribution. Some folks like Harman think there'll be some redistribution. Basically, the powerful will recognize that, well, if you piss off the weak enough, eventually everyone will get together and they will come and overthrow you. Even if the weak are individually weak, if you make them angry enough to be organized, you have a problem. So they'll give them something. And this is how potentially you end up with things like a Hayekian libertarianism, where there's some kind of social safety net. There's some kind of minimal sop given to the people who are on the losing end of the markets, but not much. Just enough that the strong would make that contract to protect themselves from uprising. But for the most part, everybody gets to keep what they have. The only way that you get stuff is by people agreeing to give it to you, and the government is there to protect life and property, the things that everybody cares about protecting. Okay. So much for kind of the theoretical underpinning. Basically, just to sum up what we've talked about already, basically libertarians tend to favor policies that go towards limited government, limited wealth redistribution, mostly free markets, mostly unregulated markets. And they do this because they think that the underlying social contract, the underlying justification of government, does not support doing anything more. If the government were to take my money, take my resources, to do anything more with it, that would be illegitimate. That would be the kind of government that we could not have gotten to without respecting everyone's self-ownership rights, everyone's voluntary transfer rights. The argument for libertarianism, it's not only this very theoretical argument that people give, though. And in fact, one of the most popular arguments for libertarianism is precisely its connection with economic freedom. Now, this is something that's not unique to the kind of theoretical libertarians I've been talking about, but it's certainly an important part of the discourse about it, an important part of the argument about it. So, most libertarians, even if they don't want to make this the fundamental grounding of their theory, will point to the connections that they see between economic freedom, living in a society where beyond enforcing contracts, the government largely does not tell you what to do with your resources, and other kinds of political freedoms. Now, Kimlicka has this long discussion that I'm not going to get into here about, well, how do we count freedoms? How do we maximize them? I think it's interesting. It's highly theoretical. There certainly are people who defend libertarianism on that ground, and he cites them, but it strikes me as not the main interesting way that people defend it, and certainly not the main way that everyday non-philosophers who are excited about libertarianism, not the way that they get excited about it. So, the core of the putative connection, right? So if you say, as a lot of libertarians will say, giving people economic freedoms to dispose of their own property the way they see fit, and have as much of that as they want, because it comes from disposing of it as they see fit, basically have as much as they want and other people will let them get. What kind of connection does this have to other kinds of freedoms? Most libertarians don't believe this is good just because they like having stuff. They often believe this is good because it is connected with other kinds of freedoms. All right, so the first thing is to recognize that there is a connection between material resources and freedom. This is substantive freedom in Kimlicka's sense. Interestingly, this is not something that's in dispute, really, between libertarians and liberal egalitarians as a theoretical point. It's actually not even something that's in dispute between those guys and gals and people like Marxists. This is actually something that almost everyone agrees on. In the fullest, most substantive notion, you need a certain amount of resources to have meaningful freedom. If you tell me, well, you're free, there's no rule saying you can't do what you want. It's just that you have to ask the government for permission to use any physical object, or you have to ask someone else for permission to use any physical object. Well, you're not going to end up very free. So what almost all political theories agree on is that you need some kind of resources in order to be able to exercise your freedoms. And so for a lot of libertarians, this is the core of the connection between economic freedoms and other kinds of freedoms, right? You want freedom of speech? Well, that's all great, but you can't really exercise freedom of speech if you can't eat, right? If you die of starvation, you don't get to exercise your freedom of speech. You also don't effectively get to exercise your freedom of speech if you don't have any way to say it, right? You don't have any way to get your message out. Also importantly, if the government decides whether or not you can eat, right? The government might not say, you're not allowed to criticize us. But if you know the government's going to decide whether or not you can eat, you may be inclined not to criticize the government, right? That's the core libertarian concern about these things. You need some resources to exercise your freedoms, both materially to exercise them and to give you the kind of insulation from retaliation that lets you exercise them. Okay. Beyond that, economic freedoms have both instrumental and inherent values. So Friedman points this out, and again, weirdly, this is a place where Friedman and Marx agree. Working, creating, consuming, giving, all the stuff you do with physical materials, these are important kinds of freedoms, right? Freedom is not just about being able to criticize the government and get together in associations. Most of us in our everyday lives, what is meaningful to us has a lot to do with stuff, right? What we enjoy often involves consuming things, right? What we find meaningful often involves creating things. Our social rituals often involve exchange of physical objects. So Friedman especially hammers this point, and again, Friedman and Marx especially hammer this point, that freedom in the realm of creation and consumption of material goods, Friedman focuses more on consumption, Marx more on creation, but they're in the same neighborhood here, is itself an important kind of freedom. We should not denigrate it as sort of mere materialism or mere economic freedom. Even if it had no connection to anything else, it's an important part of being free in your life, to be free in the zone of material objects. Okay. Aside from that, economic freedom has a couple of instrumental benefits, or at least instrumental benefits that are claimed on its behalf. One is that it's hard to have economic freedom without other kinds of political freedoms. China, of course, is the big test case for this. How long can China liberalize its economy without liberalizing its political system? But it's at least their intention. In order to create economic institutions like corporations, trade associations, physical, actual markets themselves, you need freedom of association. In order for these things to work pretty well, you need a large degree of freedom of expression and information. One of the great policy illustrators of this is the situation with the internet in both China and Myanmar, or Burma. I have done work with Amnesty International. They have to use the official name, so I always say Myanmar. People who don't like the government say Burma. That won't be on the exam. In Myanmar/Burma, the government has managed to severely throttle the flow of information on the internet. But this has been very, very costly. Their economy is a disaster. China struggles with this because China knows that people need to be able to get all sorts of information in order to make a market economy work properly. But they don't want them to be talking about, democracy that much. And it's really hard to, if you want to get the maximum benefit from information sharing for economic purposes, it's really hard to throttle information sharing that leads to political freedom. The other instrumental benefit of markets is that, that's claimed for markets, is that they can balance power. This is the kind of Hayekian concern. And Friedman also has this kind of concern, that if you don't have free markets, all power will be concentrated in the state. Whereas if you have markets, you make people freer, not just because market freedom is a kind of freedom, but because the state will not be able to consolidate power as strongly. Because if the state wants to do things, well, there'll be pushback from the corporations. There'll be pushback from the wealthy. If your markets are free, then there will be other loci of power besides the state. And this will support other kinds of freedom. Again, this is a more indirect kind of thing, but the idea is that, take something like censorship, right? Think about something like SOPA. The government, elements in the government at least, wanted to significantly, create rules that would, in the name of protecting copyright, significantly restrict the internet. Part of the success of the pushback was arguably because it was not just the state versus atomized individual people, but it was the state versus behemoths like Google that bring a huge amount of economic power to balance the state's military power. So, and as a result, individual people sort of caught underfoot in these battles of giants get to be a little bit freer than they would be if anyone could dominate the situation entirely and combine economic power and political power. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who argue that for different reasons, a kind of libertarian-ish society where you have a minimal government and very free markets and minimal redistribution is in fact very threatening to political freedom. In fact, a lot of the pushback against libertarianism tends not to be at the level of the deep theoretical concerns that someone like Kimlicka has. How do you count freedoms? But rather at the level of thinking that allowing the kind of market freedom that libertarians typically want to allow, allowing unrestricted distributions of material resources as long as they're based on voluntary transfer, in fact will lead to less political freedom. The first problem is that property is power. So if you concentrate wealth in the hands of individuals, this will tend to give them power over others in a way that the libertarians seemed to want to get away from, right? If you remember, the whole point of libertarianism is the primacy of individual voluntary choice. And in fact, one of the only roles libertarians give government is prevention, enforcement of contract and prevention of force and fraud. Protection of threats of harm in order to get you to do what I want. But this interacts a little bit oddly with the harm principle. And this is one of the examples that Kimlicka brings up. So Kimlicka basically says, look, imagine you've got a very simple system, or this is a modification of Kimlicka's example. So imagine you've got a very simple system. You've got two people and some land. The land is initially unowned. Person A comes along and owns the land, and then, well, what does person B do? Person B has to eat, but person A owns the only land that you can grow food on. So person A will say, look, I'm not going to force you to work on my land for minimal recompense. Not putting a gun to your head, not putting a sword to your neck, not threatening you with anything. It's just that, if you don't come to work for me for the absolute minimum, if you don't come to work for me and give me 90% of the fruits of your labor, I'm not going to let you grow food on my land. And then you'll starve. And that will be unfortunate for you. So, on the theoretical level, you have this problem that concentrations of property inevitably tend to undermine certain kinds of freedom. This is just the obverse of the insight that exercising your freedom requires a certain degree of property. So if you have massive inequalities in property, you might have people who are effectively enslaved. They may not be literally enslaved, right? There may not be rules saying that they're property, but they effectively will have no choice but to do what the property owners ask them or tell them to do. So you will sometimes hear libertarians arguing that when the government taxes you at, say, 25% of your income, this is like having to be a slave to the government for a quarter of the time. But the flip side of this problem is that if there's a system where I might not own enough property in order to be self-sufficient, I wasn't born when it was originally acquired or whatever, I might not own enough property to be self-sufficient, then I can be enslaved in a very similar kind of way by the folks who do own the property. They can tell me, and this is familiar Marxist point, basically, that the property owners then can say, no, you have to work for us, and they will only give us enough to get us in the door the next day. They'll let me keep enough of the food that I grow on the land that I don't starve to death, because they want me to keep growing food so that they can sit back and eat the rest of the food, just in virtue of having acquired the land initially. Now, these are voluntary relationships in the sense that no one put a gun to my head, but they seem coercive in a deeper sense. Now, the problem, of course, is that if the libertarian admits that these are coercive, it threatens to turn them into a liberal egalitarian, because then you get back into these questions of, well, what is a direct harm? This is not a direct, taking the land is not a direct harm to me, blah, blah, blah. This would lead you down the route either of liberal egalitarianism or Marxism, or left libertarianism, that the policies will look a lot more like liberal egalitarian or Marxist policies. Yeah. A little bit less up in the stratosphere, property can buy political power. One of the advantages claimed for libertarians is sometimes that it separates political and economic power, but of course you can use your property to sway the politicians as much as you can use your property to sway the workers. So in the democratic ideal, one of the expressions of moral equality is that political power is equalized. One person, one vote. Whereas on a system where there is minimal redistribution of wealth and property, and where there can be large property inequalities, it will turn out that some people's votes are worth more than others. This is the situation to a large extent in the contemporary US. Without having to get partisan about it, it is almost conventional wisdom. It is almost uncontroversial in the US that, well, some people's opinions count more than others, even though we all formally get one vote. Because people with property can sway politicians directly, they can sway the media so that people will agree with them, that sort of thing. And finally, some folks will argue that the values that underlie, well, all right, so let me just back up for one sec. So there can be a little bit of a tension here. Both the libertarians and the liberal egalitarians and the utilitarians and the Marxists and everybody will claim that what they're trying to do is work out a sense of moral equality. The concern is that expressing moral equality through complete freedom in the markets to stand or fall as you will is deeply in tension with expressing moral equality through equalized political power. There's a sense in which, Robert Dahl talks about this, there's a sense in which democracy, one person, one vote democracy, is a form of power redistribution. And that kind of, the goals of that redistribution are potentially undermined by a non-redistribution of wealth. Okay. Finally, some folks will argue in a slightly different way. They'll say, look, political freedom requires certain kinds of moral values. particular, are focused on the common good and self-restraint for the common good, self-sacrifice for the common good. Whereas markets encourage competition and dominance rather than cooperation and self-sacrifice. Markets teach you to look out for number one and then, hope that through the invisible hand maybe everything works out. Some people will say, no, in order to make a democracy work, everybody has to be focused on cooperation. You can't make a democracy work that way. And even though there's nothing absolutely stopping someone from being competitive when it comes to the market and compassionate and focused on the common good when it comes time to engage in politics, psychologically, that's not how humans are set up. If you spend your whole day being competitive in the markets, you're probably going to be competitive in politics too, is the idea, at least. All right, coming into the home stretch. Why should policymakers be libertarians? First is, minimizes government interference in people's lives. Lots of people who are libertarians, certainly the deep philosophical libertarians, think that this is just a good thing. Government interference involves coercion, recognizing the moral equality of people, generally speaking, means recognizing that no one has a right to dominate and lord it over others. So the government should not be able to tell you what to do, except in extremely limited kinds of ways. And this, it doesn't absolutely minimize it. The absolute minimum would be anarchism, but folks like Nozick and Gaudier, they think, well, there are reasons not to have no government. We can talk about them, but they think there are reasons not to have no government. And this is the minimal kind of government where you get only the things that are good, maybe necessary evils out of government without getting into all of the excesses of government. A lot of folks, Friedman included, will argue that historically and maybe conceptually, free markets, minimal government, minimal interference, minimal redistribution are associated with democracy and political freedom. Dahl talks about this as well in the section from On Democracy, that most of the liberal democratic polities, the ones that look like what most mainstream, at least American and European political philosophers think that an ideal state should look like, most of these have been market economies with greater or lesser degrees of regulation, but fundamentally systems where the primary motor of distribution is voluntary exchange. Libertarians will argue that policymakers should be libertarian because it's consonant with important values, important moral values, fundamental moral values like freedom, but also personal responsibility. Some will add thrift and hard work, a kind of Protestant work ethic, that they think are important for people in general. And that finally, and though this is a little bit in tension with the folks who would defend thrift and hard work, a lot of folks will argue that because of the minimal interference, Nozick certainly thinks this is a main virtue of libertarianism. It does not involve the government promoting any particular ideology or view of what the good life is. If you remember, the liberal egalitarians claim this as a virtue of their theory. They claim that their theory is based on not promoting any particular vision of what a good life is. But libertarians will say, once you get the government involved in redistribution of good things, you're almost inevitably going to end up with a situation where the government has to make some judgments about what's good, what's worthwhile, what's needed, what should be promoted, what should be equalized, who deserves what. Libertarians don't have to do that. Libertarians just say, let voluntary exchange do the work. Now, one caveat about this. There are probably some non-libertarians listening to this saying, oh, BS. There's no way in which the libertarian ideal of government is not promoting an ideology. To some extent, that's probably true. When we think about folks who identify as libertarians, in actual politics, they are often pro-big business, pro-free trade. Well, free trade is probably a libertarian thing, but they're often, they're pro-business. They're not just laissez-faire. And in fact, if you look at the history of a fairly laissez-faire place like the U.S., we did not, I hate to break it to you, we did not get here just by the free and unfettered operations of the markets. I'm currently reading, when I'm not prepping for this class, or spending your tax dollars on illicit activities. Yeah, this is one thing. Libertarians, take note. Professor at the University of Maryland, so your tax dollars are going to teach people about libertarianism, which is probably not on the list of things that libertarians want the government to do. Paradox. Anyway, back to the history of the U.S. I'm currently reading Philip Dre's very fine history of the labor movement in the U.S. There is power in the union. Now, of course, if you're a libertarian, you're probably going to hate him anyway, but one of the features, and this is not something that's really in serious dispute, one of the features of the history of the U.S. is that the ascendancy of large businesses was in part promoted through the use of government force. We used to call in the Army and the National Guard to break strikes. It wasn't just, well, if the workers want to get together in a voluntary association, they can go up against, if the businesses want to get together in a voluntary association, and as long as nobody uses force, hey, whatever they work out is fine. No, I mean, there was a lot of blood spilled in the creation of the modern economy. On a less violent note, you'll hear a lot of talk about corporate welfare in the U.S. There are very few, as laissez-faire compared to other economies as the U.S. economy is, there are plenty of subsidies, regulatory supports. There's all sorts of advantages given both to business in general and to particular businesses. I use in my international law class the example of discussion of U.S. cotton subsidies and the trade war we had with Brazil over it. There's probably no reason in a perfectly free market why any cotton would be grown in the United States. There are plenty of places in the world that have better growing conditions for cotton. If there is pure free trade, if governments made no interference in markets whatsoever, in voluntary exchange of goods whatsoever, probably no cotton would be grown in the U.S. We grow cotton in the U.S. because of subsidies. People make movies in Germany because of tax breaks, right? There's all of this kinds of stuff that go on that many people who call themselves libertarians tacitly or explicitly support, but that are not free exchange, that are actively promoting a system in which businesses are powerful. Here, all I can say is, let's give the libertarians the benefit of their most ideologically pure members. This is something that a lot of folks who identify as, fiscal conservatives, or who might call themselves libertarian or in favor of free markets, will end up supporting, but they're not actually supported by core libertarianism. And there are plenty of folks who are libertarians who do actually take the sort of neutral ideology view and would say, yeah, as much as we should get rid of redistribution to poor people, we should also get rid of cotton subsidies and oil subsidies and corn subsidies and all the other kind of bits and bobs of corporate welfare. So on this point, I think it's worth making a distinction between kind of purified libertarianism as would be derived from the first principles, and what people who say that they like free markets actually end up defending. Now, one of the concerns, I shouldn't talk about concerns with this slide up, with the why they should slide up, but one of the concerns we'll get to is there an inevitable connection? Is libertarianism inevitably corrupted by power in this way? Hard to say. Okay. So why shouldn't policymakers be libertarians? The first one, in a lot of ways, the big underlying one, is the argument that libertarianism's focus on limiting the legitimate reach of government and government's coercive power exposes people to non-governmental forms of domination. The idea here is just that the government is not the only institution that can be tyrannical. It might be the only institution that has guns, right? So again, give the libertarians the benefit of the pure theory that when the corporations call in Pinkertons to shoot strike breakers. That's not something that should be, shoot strikers rather. That's not something that should be allowed. But even if you assume away any violent coercion that private individuals, private associations, private corporations might get up to, there's all sorts of non-governmental tyranny that can get involved. There is the real strict sort of tyranny that talked about a few minutes ago, where if the corporations, if the wealthy private individuals own all the resources, the rest of us are forced to work for them as wage slaves, right? The rest of us have no option but to do whatever they ask us in return for whatever they're willing to give to us. Now, we own something, right? We own our labor, and if we get together with others in something union-like, we might be able to sort of collectively bargain on the value of our labor. So it's not that we own nothing, and we're probably not in quite as dire straits as some folks would paint it if people can collectively organize, right? If the libertarians are as good as their word and the government don't have the government interfere with collective bargaining of labor and this sort of thing. But the power is going to be limited, and the power is going to be more limited in advanced industrial societies where there's a high ratio of the value of capital to the value of labor. And we see this in fact going on in actual economies, right? The people who are in reasonably good shape in the modern economy, at least so far, are ones with highly specialized skills, who own a kind of, and this is why we call it intellectual capital, right? But if all you have is your labor, you're really at the mercy of people. And, intellectual capital is often the result of wealth, and the result of wealth inequalities. I am not part of the 1% looking up census data. I think I'm part of the 17%. But being able to get a PhD and be a professor and have some job security and a pretty cushy job where I'm recording lectures about libertarianism from my couch, that took a lot of investment of wealth. I was able to get here in part because I started with some wealth advantages. So even that is a function of inequality. For a lot of people, they're going to be exposed to different kinds of economic domination, even if they're not exposed to government domination. And a lot of folks would argue, better to give the government a stronger role than a weaker one for this. If this is sort of the flip side of the corporations will balance government power. This is the argument that government power can balance corporation power. If the government is weak and pathetic and useless, corporations will be able to run relatively rampant over people. So one kind of argument against libertarian policies is that this particular focus on freedom understood as property owning and voluntary transfer of property can tend to actually undermine freedom in the more substantive sense. It can lead to a society with a small cadre of owners of the property who are able to lord it over the rest of us, at least as effectively as a government with guns could lord it over the rest of us. Beyond the economic domination, restricting government power can allow lots of other kinds of non-governmental dominance hierarchies to flourish. Kimlicka makes this nice brief reference to Oken on maternal property, right? So if you remember, if you may have missed this in the Kimlicka, Oken criticizes Nozick by saying, look, on Nozick's theory, it looks like mothers should own their children. My mom created me by mixing her labor with various nutrients and that sort of thing, and then further shaped me by feeding me and all of these things. It's not clear why I should have absolute self-ownership. How is that compatible with my mom having absolute self-ownership? So what Oken basically says is that Nozick's theory assumes away women in reproduction. Nozick's theory assumes that people sprout up from the ground like mushrooms. And a lot of libertarian theories essentially assume that people sprout up from the ground like mushrooms, right? Even on the mutual advantage theory, you can imagine, well, if we came to an actual mutual advantage kind of argument, what would stop all of the women from saying, guess what? Give us extra resources or we kill all of our children. You know, give us extra resources and we refuse to bear another generation, right? The contract would look pretty different, probably, if you took that kind of power into account. So, by ignoring women in the construction of the theory, you potentially get a theory that allows certain kinds of social domination of women to thrive. Stepping back from the theoretical, think about something like, we've already opened the jar of worms on abortion, talking about the Komen Foundation in class. Think about an issue like abortion. In the US, abortion is currently governed as a privacy right. This has a lot of advantages. It makes it very libertarian friendly, it gets you some broad consensus on it. But it also has certain political disadvantages. And one of the arguments is that it opens women up to reproduction-based dominance by men, right? So, in a world where there is very minimal government intrusion into anything besides direct harm, right? Again, let's give the libertarians the benefit of the doubt that domestic violence is a direct harm that the government has an absolute libertarian right to be involved with, and in an ideal libertarian society would be thwarted, right? So we're not concerned about the fact that I'm physically stronger than my wife, and so if the government says that its authority stops at our front door, I could use that physical strength to dominate her. But I might be able to use economic power to dominate her. I can use social stigma to dominate her. If the government does not get involved in decisions about abortion, women who, because of societal norms that the government, again, doesn't get involved in on the libertarian picture, women who are homemakers and don't have formal jobs, right, who are dependent on men to voluntarily transfer some of the things that they get through their voluntary transfers in the market, well, they're going to be in a situation where if the man says get an abortion or the man says don't get an abortion, not much they can do about it. In the US, one of the things that stands out about abortion because of the privacy understanding is, thanks to the Hyde Amendment, government funds cannot be used for abortions. So any woman who does not have her own economic means cannot obtain an abortion or have significant difficulty obtaining an abortion because there's no one else who will pay for it, right? On the libertarian ideal, which is the Hyde Amendment, of course, is supported both by libertarians and by folks who just think abortion is wrong, who are something else entirely. It's not the government's job to ensure that a woman can get an abortion. And again, this feeds back into non-governmental forms of domination, right? Women who are vulnerable to pregnancy, especially if we say, also the government's job is not to fund your contraception or to make your husband or your partner fund your contraception, right? So women who are vulnerable to pregnancy and then acquire all of the vulnerabilities associated with being pregnant and bearing children can end up in a situation where they are significantly dominated in a non-governmental way. And even if we're not assuming there's any direct violence involved in this kind of domination. We can tell similar stories about racial minorities, about ethnic minorities, about ideological minorities to some extent. So there's all kinds of economic and social domination that is left untouched if you reduce the government to a very minimal role, is the argument. Right? The government may be a necessary evil, but it might be an evil that fights other evils. Five extra points if anyone gets that quote. Okay. The other thing is that libertarianism does not capture endowment insensitivity. To some extent, the libertarians are going to say, yeah, so what? We don't care. But I think Kimlick is right that at least this is a strong intuition many of us have, and one that libertarians give up at some cost. We might eventually be forced to say, well, there's so many other advantages, we have to accept that maybe endowment insensitivity is not as important as we thought it was, but it's costly to give it up. Basically, because of the focus on the kinds of decisions that could be actually voluntary, natural endowments figure into the distribution of goods, and libertarians do not think that the government should redistribute goods to compensate. So, whereas for a liberal egalitarian, they're going to say, you know, if you were born wealthy and were able to get a good education, if you were born smart, if you were born strong, none of that should make a whole lot of difference to how much stuff you end up with. And the moral intuition is that we should only be rewarded for things that are inside our control, and we should only be punished for things that are inside of our control. Libertarians are going to say, no, there might be wealth inequalities that are driven by being born into wealth. If my parents decide to give me a lot of money, and then I decide to keep that money and not give it away, well, now I have a lot of money, and I can probably make more with that and increase the inequality. It's not through anything I did, right? I didn't have any choice in whether my parents would have a lot of money or not. Libertarianism typically does not have resources to deal with that, because breaking that would require some kind of involuntary transfer. It may lead to, as we mentioned before, it may lead to very large wealth inequalities because of this, and these may potentially undermine political equality. And, as I mentioned before, the other reason why maybe policymakers should not be libertarians is that, arguably, the libertarians will argue that it supports certain important moral values. The anti-libertarians will say, yeah, but on the other hand, it undermines other kinds of moral values. It's inconsistent with focus on the common good, with compassion, with focus on community, and that sort of thing. Okay. To sum up, libertarianism focuses on which uses of government power are legitimate, rather than on what patterns of distribution are legitimate. It cares only about procedure. Any kind of distribution that comes from legitimate procedures is morally legitimate. Typically, the core, acceptable, morally legitimate uses of government power are protection of life and protection of property, and enforcement of contract as part of protection of property. Most libertarians hold those to be more or less the only legitimate uses of government power, at least the sort of philosophical libertarians. And libertarianism, in contrast to egalitarianism, embraces inegalitarian distributions that are born of unequal bargaining power. Libertarians are happy to say that some of the distributions we get may be voluntary in the sense that nobody put a gun to your head, but they don't have to be based on anything like equal bargaining power. If I am the boss of the factory, and you're a worker, and there's 100 workers like you just waiting for a job, well, that gives me a lot of power over you, but your agreement to come work for me on the terms that I set, that's still voluntary in the relevant sense. And in defense of this, they may say that despite the potential problems of this, despite the fact that this may intuitively look kind of odious, fixing it by making the state more powerful, making the state able to intervene, would actually make the situation worse rather than better. If we worry about domination by corporations, if we worry about social domination, a lot of libertarians will say, yeah, but man, state domination, so much worse, because the state has guns. And that's about it. So, next week we'll talk about poverty. See you then.